All right, CRP and Central, this is Dr. Fox. Please like, comment, subscribe. It helps the mission more than you know so that I can do more for you. Welcome to June 2026, everyone. Oh my gosh, June 1st. The weird thing is it's not June yet. So this is a pre-recording. I'm going to be out of town. And by the time you're listening to this right now, people will be at SCRS West to talk about innovation. So if you're in Scottsdale and you see me and you're watching this at the same time, I didn't clone myself. This was a pre-recording. Unfortunately, that means that I can't answer the questions. However, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at any time, and I'm happy to help. Welcome to TrialSide Chats, the place where we can come together, talk about the challenges that we have in this clinical research industry. We can help each other, talk about case studies, and we can help to enhance site, sponsor, and CRO relationships so we can have a better industry, period. All right, so by the way, I heard the comments and I understand it and I'm going to work on that. This has got to be by far the most freaking mouse I've ever had for mouse clicks. It was supposed to be this really nice, fancy, colorful mouse. It's Steel series. It's supposed to be really cool, but Steel, the clicks are just insanely loud. So if you have a recommendation for a better mouse, a silent mouse, I think I'm in the market because I'm not sure I'm a fan of these clicks. Full disclaimer. So this is the culmination of experience of sites. I am not a lawyer. I never said I was. And I ask that you please watch TrialSide Chats at your own risk. By continuing, you've agreed. And if you don't agree, just shut the video off right now. No harm, no foul. All right, so let's keep going here. The ground rules. So we're going to talk about anything finance. This is a very sensitive subject. It must be confidential. That is part of the rules. We're not going to talk names. We're not going to talk organizations. We're only going to talk concepts so that we can maybe target those best practices to help everyone succeed. All right, see, I'm getting better at the disclaimer and the ground rules. We're going faster. That's great. Icebreaker. Why should I send an invoice for startup when the sponsor is offering auto pay? Very, very good question. I'm glad I saw this one. So you're absolutely right. So there are big CROs out there right now. They're trying to automate the startup payment. They're targeting that startup payment for automation, which is really interesting to me. I've seen a couple try to automate closeout as well. And I don't buy it, folks. If they wanted to automate things, they could have automated things that like monitoring visits, right? CRAs submit reports. We know those are automated. They could have automated protocol amendments. They could have automated anything in the regulatory world, but they target the automation of startup and closeout. And I've seen those in contracts, and I've just pushed back. I said, I'm sorry, but the site is going to have to send an invoice for this. Oh, well, we're trying to make it more seamless. We want to automate. But when you go to auto pay something, you are essentially, as a site, trusting that the sponsor and CRO are going to process that payment. It looks good on, all right, we don't have to send an invoice. But think about that. Number one is sponsors and CROs very, very often try to make it so that the startup payment is payable. Guess when? At greenlight. So instead of CTA execution, they try to make it payable at greenlight. And when they control the ability to send you money and take away your ability to request that money, they have just taken control over something that they probably shouldn't have had. So when you see this, it is probably not a convenient thing for you, but it is definitely a convenient and controlling thing for the sponsor and CRO. Sponsors and CROs, it's a really, really good effort. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about innovation. But if you want to talk about true innovation, I don't know if that startup payment is going to be a way to start. You really, really may want to start targeting the things that you know in EDC that sites are having to invoice for anyway, like reconsents or protocol amendments or any of the things that are left on the table over the course of the trial, not the most targeted thing ever in the trial process. So don't let them control that. And sites, send an invoice no matter what. That would be my recommendation. All right. Here's the book. We're going to talk about the book today. There's the link that should send you to Amazon. If you'd like to purchase it directly from CRPN, it's 10% off and you get free shipping. So let us know. All right, publication alert. So what we're talking about right here throughout the course of TrialSide chats has been peer-reviewed, published for impact. This is an awesome case study. A very special thank you to Brad Hightower for the opportunity to talk about how we can make the finances for our community research sites better, accountable, and validated. All right. This was a really, really hard presentation for me to put together. And I need to share a brief story about this because in my opinion, this with the hidden costs of visits has got to show some of the worst signs in the industry. I remember many, many negotiations ago, I was working with a doctor who was part of a CRO, and we were talking about their trial setup and what they're going to do. And he sat there and he was talking about if patients were not compliant, if they didn't stay there and perform the trial accordingly. He said something that has resonated with me for years. And he goes, well, if they don't do what they're supposed to, then they're no good to me. They're no good to me. I about jumped out of my chair, everyone. I'll be real honest. That is why, that is the mentality of many, many people, unfortunately, in this industry. If they don't give me the value that I need from them, then they are no good to me. Wow. Maybe this isn't the right industry for that individual, but there's a lot of finance around this. So screen fails and unscheduled are both situations in the industry when there's work performed that frankly is without value. You had to do it. I guess it's the quote cost of doing business is what some people say, but you didn't really get a whole lot out of it. You didn't get the data that you needed to progress research, or in an unscheduled visit, it's this really, really open-ended thing where it's kind of a loose end. And so unfortunately, in these situations, the greed, or maybe not greed, but at least the financial responsibility of the sponsor and the CRO come through and become prioritized over the safety and the consideration of some of our trial participants. So I get frustrated with this story, and this is why I wanted to carve it out into its own episode, so maybe I could focus and localize my frustration in a single video. But I know we're pre-recording, but please send your comments in here. I really, really want to understand what you have experienced as a result of screen fails and unscheduled visits. So we have our schedule of assessments. We did that last time. We have all of our visits performing, everything that is planned. So we have all of the informed consent of all of the visits over here. Over here, we have the costs. We've calculated the overhead. We made sure that overhead is calculated on everything. And now we are ready to start looking at some of the nuances. So we're going to look at screen fails, and then we're going to look at unscheduled visits, because these two are some kind of like the loose end components of a clinical research budget that you have to look at before you really get into the invoiceables. All right, so let's start with screen fails. So screen fails are payments of services that are performed for potential trial candidates. And keep in mind, we're talking about candidates before they're participants who do not meet a trial's inclusion or exclusion criteria. In other words, we went through the screening visit, we took labs, we interviewed, we did an assessment, whatever it is, but we found the visit, unfortunately, did not meet inclusion exclusion criteria. Now, again, it could be lab results. Some numbers were high and low, whatever it might be. It could be an interview assessment. It could be something came up about patient history that didn't come up during the screening. Oh, well, that came up, and now all of a sudden the patient is no longer eligible for the trial. Whatever it is, sites have just worked with the patient. They've just followed the protocol accordingly. They did everything they were supposed to do, but it just didn't work out. So what happens in that situation? Now we're in a situation where sites have just performed work. They've performed it according to protocol. They did everything they were supposed to do. And the sites can't necessarily control whether the patient is qualified for a trial. They can do everything they can to pre-screen and prevent additional work and effort with a patient who doesn't meet inclusion exclusion. But even if they've done everything right, it just didn't work out. Now, sponsors, it's considered a giant loss for them. They no longer have any data. It's literally just, they just burned money. So sponsors are paying for a screen fail, they get nothing out of it, and they consider it a giant loss. It's very, very bad to them. But what's worse is, have you ever heard of the stories of the sites who have the bus tours around a city, where they pack up patients and then take them on a bus tour to every site in that city? Patients go out, they go in for a screening, they get their stipend, they come back into the bus, and they go to the next site, and they rinse and repeat, sometimes for the same exact trial. Yeah, there's a lot of scandal. There's a lot of scam, and there's a lot of corruption in the world of what they call milking screen fails. And so in a perfect world where sponsors are sitting there saying, these screen fails are going to bankrupt me, I'm not getting anything out of it, I don't want to pay for it, so I have to protect myself from them, to a world where there are some very greedy and unethical sites out there who see an opportunity and seize it and just try to take as from the sponsor as possible, without adding value or without supporting that sponsor's trial. Of course, something's going to happen. On the other end, however, sites are sitting there saying, we just did this protocol, we did everything like we're supposed to, so why are we having to eat the costs of these screenings? What the heck's going on here? Why are we sites being punished for what other sites that we have nothing to do with, what those guys are doing? This isn't right. And then finally, they have to, so the sites always have to ensure that everything they do at that trial, because they're only paid for a trial, everything they do has to get paid for. It's not like a site is going to sit there saying, we have some other source of revenue that's going to pay for this, that's going to subsidize the screening visit. We're going to have this paid for. So between the sponsors worried about losing money without value, and they're trying to protect themselves from the scammers, and between the site sitting here saying, we don't want the sponsors taking advantage of us, we don't want to have to do work for free, how are we going to support this with resources? It's just this giant contention. And that's why it really shows the worst in this industry, because what's the one thing that's missing from this entire equation? Sponsors worried about money and getting taken advantage of, sites worried about doing work for free and getting taken advantage of. It's the trial participant, it's the candidate. Nobody is looking at what this candidate is doing. And so as a result, this is kind of like where sites and sponsors both get really, really greedy, and they kind of overlook the patient themselves and just look at them like a number. It's a number that's either going to be good or bad, and that's all there is to it. That's why I hate talking about screen fails. I hate it. Sites do work, sites get paid, the sites are ethical, the sponsors pay what services are done. That's how it should be. But for some reason, we just get into this really weird and overly complex situation. And so now we have to negotiate screen fail provisions. All right, so screen fail provisions have this giant tier of things that they can do. They can range all the way from everything in a screen failure is paid, and if a site's look like they're abusing it, the sponsor's just going to tell them to stop, all the way to some of the more basic trials where no screen fail is going to get paid at all. And that's just part of the contract. Sites sign the contract. It says if this is a screen fail, then you're just not going to get paid. Sometimes it's even, if this is a screen fail and we've already paid you, we're going to claw it back because you've gotten money that you didn't deserve. One thing that you don't see on here is sometimes screen fails can be auto pay. So a lot of the big sponsors, big CROs, they'll auto pay screen fails, but they're not going to tell you necessarily in the contract. It's not like it sits there and says screen fail, auto pay. So generally what happens is when you have your first couple screen fails, you probably want to send an invoice anyway to see if it gets paid. And then sometimes it'll get rejected and they'll say, oh no, we're auto paying screen fails. At least then you know. But what you don't want, especially if you don't negotiate a proper IWL, is you don't want to sit there, think that you're getting auto paid, and then all of a sudden 6 months down the road, see you're not getting paid anything, and then realize that you were supposed to send an invoice this whole time. So you got to be real careful with that. Screen fills can also be flat. In other words, a flat rate. For every screen fill, you get this amount of money. But most of the time, sponsors try to itemize it. So they say you're only going to get paid for what you do. So you got to be real careful with that, because if you get paid only for what you do and you have an additional limitation, then you're going to really hurt yourself when you've exhausted your allotment of screen fills and you've only been paid for like an informed consent. And then when you have to do other screen fills, then you'll have to do a bunch of work that's not paid for. Not a good combination. So there's a series of provisions that sponsors will put together to assess screen fills or to protect themselves from screen fills based off of risk level. And by risk level, I mean the risk of a site performing work without pay. So the first one is always, it's the least risky, it's caps. So in other words, sponsors will sit there and say, okay, well, you're only allowed 3 screen fails over the course of the trial. You're only allowed 2, whatever it is. Most of the time, if there's a cap, it should not be itemized because you're already being limited by a cap. You should have, if you have a cap, it should be flat. But the other thing is, most of the time when it comes to a cap, the sponsors can say, well, we're going to give you 3, but if you need more, just ask and we'll approve it on a case-by-case basis. So they always have the door open in case you need more screen fails, but they definitely want to be very, very risk averse when it comes to the screen fail provisions. So the other one is, and as you go up, where I'm going to skip combinations because we have to explain the other ones first, but the next one is discounts. So hold on just a second. There's a lawnmower. I mean, I'm very thankful that he's mowing, but. All right, we're just going to have to hear it. Sorry, everyone. So a very special thank you to this gentleman here. His name is Thomas. And Thomas works at a place called Mad About Trees. And he has been very kind to help my family with the lawn care as I've been traveling. So a big shout out to Thomas. I don't mean for you to think that I don't appreciate what you're doing, Thomas. Discounts are just that. So when you get discounted, the idea is that you perform the screen fail and hopefully you get paid for all screen fails. However, you're not going to get a full percentage of the screening visit. They're going to discount the screening visit based off of the theory that not all of the work is going to be done. But rather than being itemized, they're just going to sit there and say, on average, you're not going to be doing 20% of the work. So we're only going to give you 80% of every screen fail. Really, really nice consideration. However, that's bad if there's a combination. The next step is, let's say that instead of discounts, you're getting ratios. And ratios are honestly the most common provision for screen fails. It's almost like an industry expectation now, where they're pretty much putting the site on a commission. So it's not a cap. It's not a guaranteed number of screen fails that you get, but it's saying that every time you randomize a patient, you're going to get some number of screen fails as a result. So the ratio itself can go both ways. You can either have a fraction of a ratio. In other words, you have to randomize a bunch of patients just to get one screen fail, or it can go the other way, where you get multiple screen fails for a single randomization. Vaccine studies are perfect for the fraction ones. So when you have hundreds and hundreds of patients, sometimes it'll say you that's like a 1-to-10 ratio. Patients that you enroll, you get one screen failure because there's such a high volume. Some of the really, really intense oncology or liver studies or rheumatology studies where it's just you're going to screen more than what you're actually going to enroll, you're going to see ratios like 3-to-1, 5-to-1, 10-to-1. I saw a 15-to-1 ratio one time on a super hard study where they know that you're going to screen fill a bunch of patients, but they still want to limit themselves. And so as a result, they're going to sit there and say, okay, well, here's your ratio. And then finally, the combination. So once you have cap, discounts, I saw instead of paying for screen fills, they paid for a screening subscription that was monthly. So now you just screen a bunch of patients and they pay you a monthly flat rate for all of your efforts as long as you fill out your pre-screen logs. There's always these ways to protect from the abuse of getting money for screen fails services. The problem is, and this is something you really got to watch. So they're going to sit there and they're going to say, okay, well, it's going to start with some ratio, some ridiculous ratio. And then not only is it a ratio where the sites are going to risk underfunded or unfunded work, but then they're going to say it's also like a discount or it's also a cap in addition to the ratio. Combinations are where it can really get you in trouble sites because it's so throttled down that there's no way that you can possibly recover from what's happening. Flat versus itemized. So let's talk about the provisions. What are the limiting provisions? So you've got flat versus itemized. You have the potential for caps, discounts, ratios, all of these things put together and be really, really bad. So one thing to be conscious of is you can say, you know what, we as a site, we're going to allow one limiting provision. You can pick one. And whatever that is, that's what we can stick to. But you can't do combinations at all. If you're going to do caps, it's going to have to be a flat rate. We're not going to do itemized because we're already limited. Same thing. If you're going to do caps, we're not going to do a percent. If you're going to do ratios, now this is the important thing. If you're going to do ratios, we're not going to do work for free, and we're not going to do work thinking that we're going to be doing work for free. So if you're going to do ratios, the one combination you could do is you could say a pre-randomization provision. In other words, during your ratio, you get that first level of ratio before you randomize. You've got to get something to prime the pump here, guys. You can't just sit there and say, we're going to do work for free until we randomize someone. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Another couple things to consider is the communication plan with the site team. So if you have exhausted scripts and you know that you're never going to get paid for another one, you need to let your coordinators know. In fact, that's the one thing that I talk to my coordinators about is be conscious of how many screen fails we are allowed to be paid at any certain time. Because if that number is 0, then you have to really ask yourself, is that work going to be safe for that patient if I'm not getting paid for it? And the answer is probably going to be no. So the other thing that is really, really important here is we've got to talk about overstepping of sponsor control. Sponsors are so conscious about overpaying or losing money trying to screen patients and screen failures that many times they try to control the process. In other words, you're not allowed to screen someone unless we say so. You got to be real careful with that because sponsors will try to take that over, and there's some major ethical problems to consider with that. Number one is sponsors, if you are trying to control the screening process, I would encourage you to revamp the clauses of your contract, but also think about that on an ethical level. If you were to overstep and control the screening process, you could be seen as cherry picking if you're not putting that in the hands of the independent contractors that you're signing a contract with. So you got to be real, real careful with that, everyone. If you want additional information on this, page 96 is perfect. And we're going to move. So whoop, best practice alert, best practice alert. Here we go, everyone. So one thing that you can do to ensure that you are constantly taking care of your trial participants and your potential trial candidates is that you can make it an SOP. All trial services must be fully funded by the sponsor at all times at this site. Have that in your SOP. The sponsor is responsible for paying for the services that you do. If at any time you are not getting paid or the sponsor doesn't want to pay you anymore for the services provided, it's probably not a good relationship anyway. So it's really, really important, and I can't stress this enough. There's no reason why a site should be doing work without support. That is not safe for the patient. And whoever invented this protection around screen fails just needs to work with better people. So it's never ever a closed door. Sites, if you are running into screen fails and you realize that you're not getting paid for them, you can always, always go to the sponsor and say, hey, this has been really hard to screen for. Got a bunch of screen fails. Can we have more screen fails, please? Because we're going to have to continue this work. The sponsor can say yes or no. If they say yes, they say, yes, sure, we'll approve 3 more screen fails. Go ahead. If they say no, the answer is probably going to be, well, you have the highest screen fail rate of all the sites we're working with. I'm sorry, we can't approve that. That happens, sites. There's your answer. Stop screening. I mean, I hate to say it, but depending on how risk averse you are, if you have a sponsor sitting there saying, wow, well, we really appreciate what you're doing, but we expect you to do work for free, the answer is stop working and find some sponsors and some trials who can support the work that you are doing. All right. So screen fails are one line item that are under don't want to, quote, waste money on patients that don't give them value. Sometimes that's bad on the site. Shame on you, sites. But most of the time, it just sounds greedy, sponsors. I understand why, but at the same time, I don't understand why. Now, an unscheduled visit is different because an unscheduled visit is when the patient's already randomized. They're in. But guess what? Research happens, everyone. That's just part of it. So there are things that could be happening in research, SAE, things that were unplanned. I didn't realize this could happen. USVs happen. And so as a result, this is kind of like one of those open-ended things that sponsors are super cautious of and try to protect themselves from, but unfortunately, it's at the cost of patient safety. So USVs are unscheduled visits. They're unplanned services from the schedule of assessments that may result from the need to follow up for patient safety and maintain compliant research performance. Let's say a patient had an SAE. They may have to come in for an additional blood draw, an additional review. They may have to come in to reconsent. Sometimes the USVs are the mechanism for reconsent if a patient only comes in every 6 months and a protocol amendment happened and they're like, hey, we really got to reconsent this patient before the next 6 months. They'll utilize the unscheduled visit mechanism. Now, as a result, anything that's unplanned is also uncertain, and sponsors, they consider this open-ended. They're like, oh crap, how are we going to plan for unscheduled visits? Well, that's a good question. How are sites going to plan for it? Unscheduled visits happen, but sponsors are sitting there saying, we don't want a blank check at all. I don't want to sit there and just give some open-ended line item that doesn't have a finite amount of money attached to it. We need to try to protect from this. Let me tell you a story, and this does happen, and this is probably one of the reasons why sponsors are feeling like this. Vaccine study. So the thing about unscheduled visits is if patients come in for an unscheduled visit, it's an inconvenience. Most of the time, it'll trigger a stipend. So now patients can see this as an opportunity to get a lot of money as a result of requesting or wanting unscheduled visits. And once they know the mechanism by selecting those, they can just go through many, many unscheduled visits, abuse the system, and get a bunch of stipends out of the system. So that's one of the case studies for the reasons why sponsors are doing this. So sponsors, I'm not unaware of the logic, and I know that unscheduled visits can cost you money, but I would ask you to consider what you are compromising with some of the sites are in the same situation. They don't want to perform work for free. They're following the protocol. We have to do this to take care of the patient, to get the data that the sponsors need. Why in the world would we be eating the cost of this when we're doing everything right? So again, we have sponsors wanting to not have a blank check and trying to protect themselves financially, and sites also trying to protect themselves financially by making sure that the resources are available for the services that they are providing. What a dilemma, right? But also at the same time, who are we not talking about here? It's the patient. So the things you got to watch for on unscheduled visits. So here's just some examples. I mean, sponsors and CROs get super creative. Number one, just like screen failures, is you have to make sure that you know if unscheduled visits are auto-paid or if they're invoiced. You also have to know if they're flat or item. Sometimes unscheduled visits can be flat. We're going to pay you this much per unscheduled visit. And then sometimes they're going to sit there and say, okay, well, we're only going to pay you for what you did at the unscheduled visit. If the patient comes in, you did a blood draw, and they walked out, we'll pay for the patient stipend, we'll pay for the blood draw, and we'll pay for the PI and coordinated time for oversight. But it has to be itemized. One thing to note, and this is huge for sites, is most CROs will not pay for unscheduled visits that happen before randomization. This happens in very, very long screenings where, let's say, a patient comes in for a biopsy, or they have to wait on labs or lab results, or there's a washout or something like that. Coordinators have to see the patients. It's not the screening visit yet. We're still in pre-screening. And so they trigger an unscheduled visit so that the patients can come on and we can collect the data for inclusion/exclusion criteria assessment. And all of a sudden, the finance team sees there's an unscheduled visit. They send an invoice, and 3 to 5 months later, the CRO comes back and says, well, no. This unscheduled visit happened before randomization, before baseline. We're not paying for it. That was part of it. So it screws sites all the time. Sites are trying to screen. They get unscheduled visits because they have to. The coordinator didn't know any better. And now the sites are eating visits. They're eating unscheduled visits like crazy during the screening process. So you got to watch that. And it might be best to try to put that in the language, saying that unscheduled visits, even during screenings, are paid. That's a really, really good thing to consider. Another thing, and this goes back to the whole participant trying to use the system for stipends, a lot of sponsors will try to protect themselves by rationing unscheduled visits per participant. Every participant is only allowed 2 unscheduled visits, and that's it. Everything else, the site's going to have to eat. Really, sponsors? I get it, but there's got to be a better way. What if you just said that there's no stipends during an unscheduled visit or something? I don't know what it is, but it's not to sit there and say unscheduled visits, which, by the way, are used for compliance and for patient safety. Oh, we're going to have to ration the patient safety for these participants. We're only going to allow so much safety on these participants. Not a good way. There's a better way to solve this. There's got to be. Capping the unscheduled visits. We're only going to allow up to this amount of money for an unscheduled visit. How is a site supposed to perform the services required if they are on a limited budget for an unscheduled visit? I guess we can't do a blood draw on this one. The sponsors not approved this. How's that going to work out? The big one, an unscheduled visit, something that is unscheduled, unplanned. I had no idea this was going to happen. It's a surprise to everyone, and we are in a state of critical time when it happens. So it requires prior approval. Hey, sponsor, we just had a patient who had a massive SAE and they're hemorrhaging, and so we've really got to assess them. Can we have permission to have an unscheduled visit, please, so we can make sure they're safe? Click. We'll talk to you in 3 to 5 days. No. Prior approval for unscheduled visits is a massive, massive compromise for patient safety, everyone. Not a good provision to protect. Figure out a better way, sponsors. And finally, kind of like its own little version of withholding, but there are some CROs out there who sit there and say, well, all of your unscheduled visits are going to be payable at closeout. So you may have performed an unscheduled visit 2 years ago. Oh, and by the way, we just signed an extension to this trial for another 3 years. So what you did 2 years ago, you might get paid in a total of 5 years from the date of service, because we're not going to pay you until closeout. What? Really? I guess that's withholding. That's like their way of trying to do withholding. But how in the world are you supposed to fund a site's services when you do work and then hope to get paid in 5 years? And it's happening right now. So really, really highly restricted unscheduled visits. And again, it brings out the worst in the industry. It brings out the protection from greed, and it brings out the inconsideration of patients, and just not a good thing to think about. But unfortunately, if you're a negotiator, administrators, and sites, you have to protect your patients from this all of the time. All right, so that concludes the discussion of screen fails and unscheduled visits. I would recommend listen to this and go back to the last one and talk about scheduled events again, scheduled assessments, and you're going to see that they all kind of weave in together. Watch this one and then go back to the provisions, because we talked about a lot of provisions. This is added in layers. And so next week, once we start coming back, we are going to start to jump into those invoices. So we've done all of the provisions, we've done all of the budget, we've put that together, identified our cost, however our site wants to do it. We've identified what we want to do with screen fails and unscheduled visits. It's time to talk invoices, my friends. Invoices are a very, very interesting one. So next week, keep an eye out. We may pre-record. We'll see how this one goes. And let me know if you have any comments about screen fails and unscheduled visits and how your site manages the balance between financial responsibility and sponsor satisfaction and patient safety. All right, another announcement, SCRS Site Solution Summit. Odds are I'm at SCRS right now in Scottsdale. I'm talking with the SCRS team, but the big one is this October. So the 20th anniversary for the SCRS Site Solution Summit. I am stoked. The hotels are already booking up. It's going to be a really, really amazing time. I highly recommend, if you can get yourself to that 20th anniversary, it's going to be well worth it. And if you want to come see CRPN, check us out at booth number 920. That's right. CRPN is exhibiting at SCRS Site Solution Summit. So here's the website, LinkedIn, YouTube. Remember, sites, you can join CRPN for free. Sponsors, I know that we're talking a lot about sponsors and what's going on here, but it's only because I care about you and I want things to be done properly. If you want to know how to really solve this industry, CRPN a call. You can join affordably and you're going to see a difference. This is Dr. Fox. Please like, comment, subscribe, share your voice. See you next time.